Okay, well, welcome to video lecture number 2 or 3, depending on how you look at it. We're going to talk about today the lymphatic system and immunity. And it's a nice topic to follow the circulatory system because many of the elements of the circulatory system, in particular the white blood cells, are also involved with immunity. And so here we go. First of all, you have heard of oops, that's not the one I want. You have heard, we've talked about, I should say, the lymphatic system a little bit before. When we were on the digestive system, and we're looking at the small intestine, and these structures are called villi. Microvilli are on the end of these, but this bump here is called the villi. And we know that inside of the small intestine, the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum, is where more digestion occurred. But most of the small intestine is where absorption of what was digested occurs. We talked about where glucose amino acids go, and then also fats. And fats were a little bit different because they diffuse into the lymphatic vessel right here. Fats or amino acids and sugars go into the blood supply, which is right here, represented by the red and the blue structures. But the lymphatic system, represented by that greenish structure, that's where the fats go. And so we've talked about it just a little bit before, and so we're going to talk about it just a little bit more today. Really, the lymphatic system, though, has more functions than just carrying fats from the digestive tract somewhere. It also is involved with carrying water, fluids, back to the circulatory system. If you remember capillaries, if you look at a capillary bed, the amount of fluid, the volume of fluid coming out of a capillary bed is significantly less than the volume of fluid going into a capillary bed. It's like 60% of what went in comes out. Where did the other go? Well, remember, capillaries are sitting right up next to the cells in your body, almost all the cells in your body, and they're exchanging things, nutrients and waste. Nutrients the blood brings to tissues, and waste it picks up from them. Okay, so we know that there's exchange of material between the circulatory system and your tissues. Well, part of that is fluid, is water. And so that's going to be an aspect that we're going to talk a bit about. And then lastly, immunity, of course, is fighting disease. Of course, that's on everybody's mind these days, and we'll continue to develop your understanding of how that works in our body as we go through things here. Really, well, the medium, what is pumped, well, we talked about blood being what is pumped, the fluid that goes through the circulatory system. Well, of course, lymph is the medium, what's moving, if you will, through the lymphatic system. And lymph is kind of a combination of things. It's a combination of fluids that get picked up out in the tissues, so that 40% of fluid that doesn't come out of a capillary bed, but goes into the tissues, is picked up from the tissues in the lymph system. So that's where the rest of what goes into a capillary bed ends up. It ends up in the lymphatic system. Okay, so there is lymph in there, and it's made of that fluid. There is also proteins in there, and I'm going to explain the importance of those in just a second here. And then there are also lymphocytes, that particular kind of white blood cell that we've already talked some about. Okay, if you remember this picture right here, these are the smallest of the white blood cells. There were two types. We're going to talk about B and T lymphocytes. If we look at an actual image of them from this blood slide, okay, these would be the lymphocytes. They're roughly about this. If these red blood cells were fully hydrated, they're starting to crenate, I mentioned that before, they would be very similar in size to a lymphocyte. So they're the smallest white blood cell, but there's a lot of them also in lymph. And so we have this fluid in the lymphatic system called lymph. And there's another picture here that I think I'm going to pick on here. This is a closer look at a capillary bed, and then this idea that, you know, what flows in is not the same as what flows out. The remaining, the leftover, if you will, gets picked up in this green structure, the lymphatic system, and gets carried, well, back to the circulatory system. So we have this system of fluid balance in your body. And we've already talked about the topic of edema. If you remember this picture right here that I showed you before, has to do with the circulatory system, but the lymphatic system is also involved. Because obviously if you've got a fluid buildup in a part of your body, not just the circulatory system, but also the lymphatic system isn't doing its job for some reason. Well, this can be caused by a number of things. You might have an elderly family member that has to wear the compression socks, tight-fitting socks that help move blood and then lymph out of the extremities. Remember, this would be an area that's most distant from the heart, from the pump, and so most likely to have a fluid buildup in it. You can get fluid buildup for a number of reasons. For instance, you might have high blood pressure, and high blood pressure can cause stretched vessels. And those stretched vessels, from those stretched vessels, we'll see proteins leaking out into the system, those plasma proteins, alpha and beta and gamma globulins, albumin, those sorts of things. Okay? They'll leak out into the tissues, and when they're there, they act like salts, the generic term salts, and they draw fluid out into them. And so high blood pressure can result in fluid buildup out in the tissues too. Similarly, low blood pressure can do the same thing, because now you don't have enough pressure in the system, not enough blood flowing through at any one time. And so there's not as much ability to move fluids out of an area where they might be building up. So both high and low blood pressure can create edema. This is an extreme case. This is called pitting edema, if you remember. You can actually push on the person's skin and it leaves the impression. That's a severe case of edema. Let's see, what else did I want to say? I guess I won't burden you with that picture. There's another substance, I guess, that has to do with the lymphatic system. And it's one of those substances that has a name that I think transcends language boundaries. If I say the word pus to you and you don't speak English, I would propose that you're going to have an idea that it ain't something great, okay? That word pus. Well, what is pus? Well, pus is dead bacteria. It's fluid, it's lymph, all mixed together in that sort of pale, creamy white substance that you're familiar with seeing. Not terribly appetizing, if you will. But all that is an aspect of the lymphatic system. There are then some other structures. Let's see, I think I wanted to pull up another screen here. Where did you go? Oops, sorry. So let's take a look at lymph vessels themselves. Lymph vessels actually look a lot like veins. They're fairly thin-walled. In other words, there's not a lot of muscle here to change their shape, to make them bigger, or to make the hole in the middle bigger or smaller. They have these valves just like veins do. You remember varicose veins, when those valves get blown out because the blood flow gets constricted and it builds up here and pushes those valves out? Well, there's the same sort of valve in a lymph vessel. It's like God had a plan, he stuck with it. It worked in veins, and it works here in lymph system too. So thin-walled with valves, dependent on skeletal muscle, so you got to move those muscles. That's why it's important to move. Squeezing on the walls here, pushing that lymph through, just like veins. The difference here is that, well, A, there's not blood in there, but B, this is a one-way system, like it says there. In other words, there's not a circuit like we have with the circulatory system. Lymph is picked up out in the tissues and it's carried back to the circulatory system. It's a one-way trip. And so we're going to see capillaries, or we're going to see a structure similar to the circulatory system, but not quite the same. So, yeah, that's a lymph vessel, if you will. You've got some major lymph vessels in your body. Circuit, not a circuit, but one-way systems here. But you notice how it's not symmetrical? You'll notice how there's this right lymphatic duct right here, which drains the right arm, right chest, right head and neck region. But then you've got this thoracic duct, which drains the rest of the body. So lymph vessels from all around here are carrying lymph back towards, well, right here. Both vessels, both the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct, carry lymph back to right here. This is called the left subclavian vein. This would be the right subclavian vein. So right here, those ducts are going to dump that lymph right back into the system. Now these are veins. Remember, veins carry blood toward the heart. Boom, right into the heart goes all that lymph, okay? Here's the point from the digestive system. If you've got a high-fat diet, all that fat from your digestive tract is going to go right back into the venous system, right into the right atrium, to the right ventricle, and right back into the heart. And so that's why that fat is such a problem for, atherosclerosis, because those foam cells, which develop from macrophages, which develop from monocytes, they're going to eat that stuff up, and they're going to cause the changes in the heart wall, the vessels, the walls of the vessels on the heart, create constricted areas, rupture, create bleeds inside the vessel, create clots, and give you a heart attack or a stroke. Hopefully you can see the significance of where those lymphatic vessels connect to the circulatory system, and the importance of not having too much fat in the system because of where they do dump into. Other associated structures, if you think about, well, actually I'm going to go to one other thing. So I'm going to sprinkle some consideration of diseases and ailments in here. And there's one, I'm guessing you've heard the term blood poisoning. And blood poisoning can be a little bit of a generic term, but it is a specific condition. It's an infection, basically a bacterial, usually a bacterial infection of the lymphatic system. Let me show you what it looks like. I'm going to go to the other image first. Okay, I hope you can see this. This is also going to be on Moodle. Okay, so there's this red spot right here. And it is very common to outline it with a pen. That's what medical professionals will do to track it. We had a prof here that was dissecting a rat. He had to anesthetize the rat first. The rat, being an intuitive rat, figured out what was going on, turned around and bit him before he was anesthetized and dissected. You might say that's kind of justifiable rat biting. Well, whatever. The prof, though, the next day comes to work, and somebody noticed he had a red spot on his arm, and sure enough, just like this, or actually like the next picture, here, a red spot developed from a wound, and it started progressing up towards the heart. Now, the myth that you might have heard is that when the red spot gets to the heart, you die. That's something that people will say erroneously. Now, you got to understand, this is a lymphatic system. Yep, what's in there is headed for the heart, that's true. And this is likely an indication there's bacterial contamination in the lymph. And so when it gets to the heart, yeah, that's worse. Now you've got a systemic infection around your whole body. Doesn't mean you're going to fall over dead. Doesn't mean you better take things seriously. Our prof, he saw this coming, but knew what was going on. And so it was early in the day, saw the red line, and it does move fairly slow, tracked it like that, went about his day, did his lecture, looked at it, got done with what he had to do, and then he went to the doctor, confident in his assessment of what was going on. Anyway, that's blood poisoning. A wound creates an opening for bacteria to enter the lymphatic system. It multiplies and inflames the lymphatic system and gives you that red appearance. That would be what we would call blood poisoning. Another structure that we think of associated with the lymphatic system is lymph nodes. And I'm guessing that when I say lymph node, a lot of you are going to think, yep, right here in under your chin and your neck. And you're right, that's where there are a lot of lymph nodes in your body. Your textbook has a picture of a body with where there are clusters of lymph nodes. There are all over your body, but there are certain places where there are more of them. And here's one, which makes sense because that's a place where stuff can get into your body. What you take in through your nasal passages and through your oral cavity, yeah, there better be some guard posts, if you will, which is really what a lymph node is. that are standing ready to fight off any infection that might get in at that area. Other places where you find lots of lymph nodes, in your armpits, not too many openings there, but it is a point of constriction, you know, where you've got the rest of your arm. Similarly, in the groin region, there are lots of lymph nodes, and so we find lymph nodes there. They're really wide spots in lymph vessels here, so you see multiple lymph vessels coming together here. And so there are going to be places in here where that lymph could be evaluated, and if there was an infection there might be lymphocytes standing ready to handle that infection. So when I say guard post, that's a good way to think of lymph nodes. And you know, if you're sick, sometimes your lymph nodes become inflamed. Well, that's because there's a fight going on, a battle going on here. And so your lymph nodes stand ready for an infection or an inflammation of that sort. There's lots of macrophages there as well, which are cell-eating cells. Remember, monocytes change into macrophages, and they do, well, kind of like this video that I've showed you before, which I'll show you again. So when I say macrophage, it's good to think of this amoeba circling this paramecium. This is really how macrophages work. Now, these are different organisms, but the same sort of process. This amoeba is encircling both those paramecia, and then it's going to dump digestive enzymes into the vacuole that it has created. Oh no! And they're sensing bad things are about to happen, and they get digested. And that's how a macrophage might handle what is in a lymph node, or what's coming through a lymph node. Okay? So those are things that are going on in your lymph nodes, and important for their function. So thinking of illnesses that are associated with lymph nodes, since we're on illnesses, probably the most famous one that I can think of, and one that I suspect you're familiar with, is bubonic plague. Bubonic plague has been a problem for humanity since, 200 AD at least, maybe before that. If we take a look at some images associated with it, we can see that it is named after these swollen areas. These are called buboes. Okay? This is a swollen lymph node, and they occur in the groin, in the neck, all those places where there can be lymph nodes. They can be attacked by this pathogen, this bacterium. It's actually the bacterium Yersinia pestis, I think is the name of it. It's a rat flea. It's in a rat flea. So it's a bacteria in a flea which affects a rat. So here's how it went back in the middle 1300s. Much like our current problem with coronavirus, it's believed it originated somewhere in Asia, was carried by trading vessels in the rats that were in trading vessels to Europe. The rats hopped off and were carrying the fleas, which themselves were carrying the bacteria. Well, this was at a time when the world was experiencing a little ice age, and so things were cold, so people were more, and wet, so people were more likely to be inside than anything else. And so I'm going to go through a couple of images here. Here's an image of that rat flea. So these rats carried these fleas inside, and these fleas didn't have a problem munching on people, just the same as rats. Okay, so the deal was, though, if the rat carried the flea, and the flea carried the bacteria would multiply in the flea and plug its digestive tract. So then when the flea went to bite or to feed on a person, get a blood meal from a person, it would bite the person, but when it would bite into the person to start sucking blood, it would regurgitate some of its stomach contents, which, among other things, were those bacteria. And it would then transmit that disease to people. Now, they didn't understand bacterial transmission, bacterial diseases back then, and so off to the races we went. Now, this particular bacteria was difficult because you know how I just showed you that amoeba surrounding a paramecium, and it was like a macrophage eating a bacteria in your body? When a cell would surround a bubonic plague bacterium,